Welcome to tonight's Lynda D. Woodruff Lecture discussion on diversity, equity, inclusion, and physical therapy. I'm Jason Bellamy. I'm APTA's Executive Vice President of Strategic Communications. And tonight I have the honor of moderating a dialogue that includes 6 distinguished panelists, including, of course, the first Lynda D. Woodruff Lecturer, Gregory Hicks. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to make clear that APTA is just one of the groups involved in making this event possible. The inaugural Lynda D. Woodruff Lecture was developed by the Physical Therapy Learning Institute, which plans to continue this lecture on an annual basis moving forward. Greg Hicks' inaugural lecture and tonight's event are provided in partnership by the Physical Therapy Learning Institute, the American Physical Therapy Association, the American Academy of Physical Therapy, of which Lynda Woodruff was a co-founder, the National Association of Black Physical Therapists, and Greg Hicks' own University of Delaware. I also want to recognize the following academic institutions that were meaningful to the development and legacy of this lecture's namesake, Lynda Woodruff: Alabama State University, Case Western Reserve University, Georgia State University, the University of North Carolina, and the University of North Georgia. This lecture honors the memory of Lynda Woodruff by exploring just one of the issues she was so passionate about: diversity, equity, inclusion, and physical therapy. Tonight, we'll take your questions submitted through the Q&A here on Zoom. And so to start things off, let's meet our panel. All of them are physical therapists. All of them are leaders within the physical therapy community. In the interest of time, these intros are going to be painfully brief, so go with me on that one. Lisa Van Hoos is a board member of the Physical Therapy Learning Institute. Rob Tillman is president of the American Academy of Physical Therapy. Sonora Simpson has been an active member of APTA since 1957, and to summarize her, I'm just going to say she's an icon in our profession and association. Remy Onifade is president of the National Association of Black Physical Therapists. Sharon Dunn is president of the American Physical Therapy Association. And finally, Greg Hicks is a recent member of the APTA board, an associate vice president for clinical and translational research at the University of Delaware, and of course, the first Lynda D. Woodruff lecturer. Thank you to everyone who's watching tonight. And of course, thanks to all of our panelists for the collaboration in this event. Before we go further, I want to remind everyone watching that the Woodruff Lecture, like this discussion, are available for free of charge. But we do ask all the collaborators behind this event, ask that you consider making a donation of at least $10 to support the DEI effort of any of the groups represented here tonight. If you want to learn more about these groups and get links to where you can donate, go to apta.org/Woodruff, WOODRUFF. I also want to point out that tonight's discussion is not the end of the collaboration. One of the things we're working on now that we hope to have available soon is a page for individuals, for practices, education programs, for anyone who would like to report on what actions they're taking to improve DEI in physical therapy. Because we need to learn from each other, and most of all, we need to take action. And that really guides us right to where Greg's lecture left off. Greg, your lecture includes numerous recommendations, large and small, but all meaningful, for how people can act to influence positive change. And you closed your lecture by saying the key is that we act upon these ideas and we stop the lip service. So I want to start with you, and then I'm going to go around to everyone with this seemingly straightforward question, but maybe the most important of all. In your opinion, what's the most accessible thing that anyone watching tonight can do on their own, almost immediately, to act and to make a difference in diversity, equity, inclusion, and physical therapy? Greg?
Well, I guess that depends on where you're starting from, right? I think if you don't have a relationship with a person of color, it may be as simple and straightforward as really trying to make a genuine connection with someone who looks different than you. But if you already do have relationships, I think, especially if you're in a position of authority or power, and that could be that you're a physical therapist in a clinic where you have volunteers in your clinic, mentor someone. I talked about that in the lecture. You know, this idea that words are powerful, it's the truth. Try to really develop a genuine connection with someone. Don't treat them like they're a project, but really be there for them. There are so many people who have capacity to be successful. They may not have had the preparation or opportunities that you might have had. My parents gave me preparation and opportunity. And then I had other people who were able to push me along. But I think be there to provide those opportunities and really help someone to be prepared in those situations would be the best advice I could give.
Lisa, let's go to you. You're up next.
I would say be curious. Be curious about your own mindset. So when you find yourself thinking something about someone that may be in a negative or in a judgment light, or where you're just like, that's very different from me, ask yourself why. And then be curious about other people. So I think curiosity is one of those things we lose as adults.
Remy?
I believe, like Lisa said, ask yourself, honestly, why did we even get here? The history of why this is what it is right now today. So I think that would be the first step, I would say, is the most accessible.
Okay. Rob?
Well, I think it's imperative that this is a big initiative that we're engaging in. I think we need to think globally, but act locally and engage with patience and empathy, and giving people room to grow as we go forward without making an indictment toward the situation because we're frustrated with it, but being mindful that, especially all of us on this panel, we're all for the change in diversity and equity and inclusion, but we come from different places. All of us do. So just being patient in our engagement and trying to meet people where they are.
Yeah. Sonora?
Well, I agree with everything everyone has said, but I think the first thing is to really assess yourselves. And so I would recommend that each one of, whenever you can, that you go to the Harvard study on innate bias, and that each of you take it and honestly look at what your results are. Because quite often we always think that because we are in this, that we have no biases. But I believe that we certainly do. And so just as I do not believe that you should match up people by ethnic groups, because you may be fostering a negative kind of behavior, because each of us is biased. So I certainly agree with that business of making sure that you listen, that you associate with someone who's not like you. And that includes those of us who are African American, because we are not an amorphous group. And so that if you are an African American who's had also, as Greg has said, if your parents have given you everything on earth, you may not know anything about those persons who don't know where the next meal is coming from. And quite often that comes across to the same ethnic group. So I certainly hope that at least this group will assess how we really feel, and then do a lot of mentoring to help those who need it.
And then Sharon, I'm going to finish with you, and I'll do it by, calling out the obvious. You are not the person who's living the experience that our Black physical therapists are living. You are somebody who's approaching this from an issue of listening and learning, but you are somebody who's in a position of power and influence, and that carries a special weight right now. So, I mean, where do you sit in terms of, you have been very passionate about trying to get people to remember that they have action as individuals, regardless of what the issue is, right? DEI, any issue. So where do you sit on this?
I agree with everyone. I wrote down 3 items because I knew somebody was going to steal my thunder. And there's one thing that has not been said yet, and that is to create safe spaces to have hard conversations. And I think tonight is one of those safe spaces. But when you're in a position of authority or power, whether you're an owner of a clinic or an administrator in an academic program, you've got vulnerable people there who need to have the opportunity to express themselves and not feel like they're either going to get mistreated because they have an opinion that's different than yours as the person of authority. People need to feel validated in what their experience is and heard. And so I think that's one of the most important things that the people who are listening can do without any expenditure of resources. It's an open learning posture of, I don't have all the answers and I need to learn here. And so I hope APTA continues to be a learning environment so that people feel safe to express what their needs are professionally and what they need the organization to do. but I agree with what everyone else has said. And in this position of leadership at APTA, I also know that I'm a white person. And so I think everybody who has white privilege needs to recognize it's not because you grew up in a privileged socioeconomic status, it's just the color of your skin provided you opportunities and a starting place that puts you in a better position. And I think people need to if you don't believe that, you should really self-assess and do some self-learning about what the experience of Black and brown Americans is compared to your own.
Yeah, your life may have been hard. Your skin color was not a reason it was hard. Is basically what that boils down to.
Yeah.
And so on that note, I mean, let's just, while we're on that topic, stick with it for a second. So sometimes conversation is action. And so just to call out this conversation, right? APJ didn't have this conversation a year ago. The way we're doing this right now, didn't have this with DEI, diversity, all these issues have been in the dialogue before, but you can feel it advancing a next step, which is positive, right? And we all agree it can't end there. It has to be more than the conversation. My question is, there's this delicate balance when we recognize where we are between seizing the moment and the momentum and honestly potentially making it seem like the white people are running in to say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it without that shared experience. And how do we navigate that balance, right? How do we respect and step back, but then also show enthusiasm and desire to help? Because I think a lot of white people right now are frankly paralyzed between not knowing how to be an ally, recognizing maybe more clearly than ever before how little they understand of the Black experience, wanting to respect that they don't know things that they probably thought they better understood, right? So there, somewhere in there was an actual question. I guess where I'm going with this is how do we create a space where, as Sharon mentioned, people feel heard, people feel respected, and we can have this dialogue in a constructive way, not just today, but every day moving forward to keep chipping away at this and evolve. Greg, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think it goes back to something that Rob said in his opening answer. This idea of being open to have conversations and dialogues with people and trying to walk in someone else's shoes for a bit and try to understand their perspective without the indictments. And so that's, for some people that's easier than it is for others, but it's really trying to listen and understand someone else's perspective. I think for physical therapists, honestly, in some ways it should be easier than for most people. I think a lot of what we do in terms of our job is about empathizing with the patients that we're interacting with. And so I think it requires that level of empathy of trying to understand how someone else might view a situation. I think about close white friends that I have and the understanding that I haven't talked about certain things with them. I haven't said certain things. So I can't really expect them to fully understand something that I haven't had a conversation with them about. It's that wanting to try to connect in that way and understand someone else, I think, is a big part of it.
Remy, you have thoughts into this?
Yes. I think going back to both what Rob and Greg said, absolutely, you need to not have indictment on who you're having conversations with. That's if you are able to, right? And that was a part of what Greg was saying as well. Because there are times where we do run into colleagues that are on the opposite side of what you experience, and you have to pull them to the forefront. And sometimes even navigating that is hard because of those emotions that are evoked when that pain is coming out of their mouth that they're not understanding. But you're also trying to be civil and understand that this is a professional realm that we have to stay in. So for the most part, honestly, going off of what Rob and Greg said, that's the first thing you do. But then when you're trying to control those things, you have to understand when you need to walk out of a situation that you're not able to tolerate, and do a little bit more self-reflecting and then try again. Just know that it's not the end game with one conversation.
Lisa?
So I would start off with just talking about there has to be a common language. And what I find is I find often that white people are really uncomfortable with using the words. And so, like when Dr. Dawn put it out there about white privilege, we have to talk about it. And so, diversity, equity, and inclusion is this really nice package that makes people feel good. But we're at a place now where it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I think people have to give each other permission to say that we're going to make some mistakes in this conversation, but we are in this together. We might even have to step away from the conversation like Remy just said, but we're going to come back to it. But we're going to use the words, right? So for like our pediatric therapists, we talk about the fact that children need to know the words of their body parts. They need to know what a penis is, what a vagina is, right? Because there is power in those words. And it's the same thing with this. You got to be able to talk about white supremacy. You got to be able to talk about racism. You got to be able to talk about bias and critical race theory. Because we have to name it. And
systemic inequity. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's part of the fact that those are terms that are evidence-based terms. And there is this belief in the profession that people are making these terms up because of emotion, and that's not true. If we expect evidence-based in our clinical practice, then you have to use the evidence-based terms in these discussions.
Rob, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, you know, I like to engage with people that would have the open mind of a Sharon Dunn, who I love to death. I tell you that every time we engage. You're
Rob,
magnificent.
I love
But
you back.
thank you very much. But the thing is, not everybody's going to be where Sharon Dunn is. Okay, so when we talk about dealing with people that are equally yoked as far as embracing the issue, and first of all, admitting that there is an issue, that's the first thing that frustrates us as Black folks, is that a lot of times over the years, there even being dialogue on whether or not there was an issue was something that was extremely frustrating and drove me to an extremely militant state for many years of my life, to where I was too angry to have dialogue about it. And secondly, after there's an admission and a recognition that there are issues, then we have the reckoning after that. So it's in phases as we go forward. It's not a one-step process. We have to look and see that there is a problem, admit that there's a problem, and not everybody will admit that. But those folks that will, like the folks that are engaged in this dialogue and on this panel, and probably most of the folks, if not all of them, that are listening in on this, and those folks are going to be the ones that drive this forward by example and engagement.
Sonora, I mean, you have.
It's very interesting to listen to this, because I want you to know that as far as the APTA is concerned, all of this stuff has been done over the years. And what bothers me now is that this is going to be one more of those. You have a talk, and you make a speech for somebody once a year, and Gregory, congratulations. But you see, we've done this with many things over the years. We'll have, and it's one and done. And even when we developed the minority scholarship, the minority scholarship originally was to address some of this issue. We now have morphed into diversity. So I want to know what we are talking about here, and we've got to say it. Are we talking about increasing Black people's participation, or are we talking about diversity, which means that you're morphing in the brown and anybody else who happens not to be white? So I want to know what are your goals here? Are we really talking about increasing Black participation? Because when I graduated in 1957, we were 1% African Americans. There were 100 of us in the country. When you think about it, the percentage has not improved of getting the people in the profession. So until you do that, you still will be those people, and yes, we've addressed it nicely, and therefore, but then when you go to practice, the practices are all Black all white, and never the twain shall meet. So a lot of people have opted out of even integrating within the where you work. So Robert was talking about being pissed off, and I don't doubt it at all. So what do? What we do is that we will work and associate with our own. And so I don't agree with the National Black PT Association. I don't do Black PTs. I do PTs who happen to be Black, that have that extra something, and that they have some insight and lived experiences that nobody knows. But you've got to say it, and we've got to decide what is it we want to do, and then move forward. But you are going to have to do it one person almost at a time, because no, there are not a lot of Sharons in this whole business. And I can assure you that you'll get another president of the APTA where this will die on the vine. So it's up to us to do it, but we've got to decide, are we aiming for diversity, or are we aiming to increase the number of African-American PTs in the profession?
So let me take a shot at that, just in terms of framing this conversation, and then I'm going to go to Sharon while she collects herself here. So yeah, in terms of framing, so my understanding of what the vision is for the Woodruff lecture is, I mean, they picked long-term DEI, I think, to try to be inclusive of many issues, probably over a period of time. Tonight, we're talking about the issue of Black participation and diversity in our profession. At least that's where we are right now. We can always morph into other topics. So that's really what we're talking about at the moment.
You see, but you added, you see, you did two. You said Black participation and diversity, entirely different. So I want to decide, what is it? Now, are we going to bite off this elephant and say that we're going to start with Black PTs, and then maybe after we can get people thinking a little bit brighter? Because you see, in diversity, when I looked at the minority scholarship, I didn't see very many Black people getting the scholarship. And I was really concerned, so much so that my will says that whatever I'm giving to that scholarship must be given to a Black physical therapist, not a person of color, not Caribbean, an African-American PT. And that's because my goal is to get more African-American PTs active in the profession.
Good point. Sharon.
So I'll say, Sonora, you've got 50 years of advocacy and frustration built up in your comments, and I love you for it, because you've not given up. You have been in the mix since the time you entered this profession. And I also want to say I am not the only white ally or accomplice that's out there. There are many of us who really are with you in this challenge, and I appreciate the love that I've gotten on this call, but I also know there's a huge army of us out there ready to go in this direction. Sonora, I would say to your question, is this diversity or is this Black? I would say that APTA right now is making database decisions more than I've ever seen with what we're doing according to the future of the profession and the strategic plan that we built for 2019 through 21. And when you look at the data that Greg presented in his Lynda Woodruff lecture, the data is amazingly compelling. And Black physical therapists are on the downslope, and other minority groups are on the upslope at getting into physical therapy schools. So the data shows us where our efforts need to be related to diversity and adding to the cadre of physical therapists that match the public that we need to be treating in this country. So my answer to your question, Sonora, is yes. The data tells us right now that we've got a lot of work to do to put more Black physical therapists into clinics and into hospitals and into systems, so that the public that need our services are getting the access to the care that they need. And we know, based on social determinants of health and based on patients wanting to be treated by someone with shared experiences, that their outcomes are much better when when they have access to physical therapists or other healthcare providers that share the experiences that they have. So I would say, Sharon Dunn would say, the data is driving our action right now. And Greg's data that he presented, not only where APTA's metrics are, but how a change in the accreditation criteria for med school through LCME made a compelling difference. So we don't have to do that research as Greg suggested. The data's there, we just need to act. And I also want to thank you, Sonora, for asking the question, what happens when my term ends? Because this work began actually many years ago with the Minority Scholarship, but there was a reaffirmation and a recommitment to this work in 2016, and I'll tell you when it happened. I was at the beginning of my first term as president, and we hired a new CEO, Justin Moore, and he began to incorporate strategic thinking into how would we approach our centennial year with creating an organization that was fit for the future, that would steward what we needed to be into the future. And I was sitting at APTA headquarters with him with a whiteboard and drawing out what 7 bold moves would look like for the organization. And one of them was a new building, a new workplace for the APTA. Another was a brand alignment, and one was to ignite the spirit of diversity. And that came from the CEO with a question mark. We want to ignite the spirit of diversity, hoping that the flame will catch, not knowing where the profession was, where the organization was. Well, it didn't take long for the flame to catch when we started just using these words. And more than igniting the spirit of diversity, since that time, we have had a House of Delegates motion that came before the House that compelled us to reaffirm our commitment to these efforts. And that was a student-driven motion that came from some students in Arizona who went to a diversity event. And they said, that's funny, this event is about diversity, but everybody here is white. What's wrong with that? So those students went to their delegation in Arizona and said, we need to do something about this. They compelled the organization to act. So everyone in this organization has an opportunity to produce a sustainable action. And then in 2018, Lynda Woodruff died, and that changed me. If you listen to that 2018 address, that was how I was moved related to who this woman was, and everything that she did for the profession. But that I knew her, but I didn't know her until her funeral. I knew her as a loud and big presence at our meetings, but I didn't know the impact of her influence on everyone that she touched personally and intimately through her mentoring, the Woody Babies, as we call them. I also knew that Geneva Johnson had brought her into Case Western Reserve, and Geneva did holistic admissions before it was a thing. I've personally talked to Geneva, and she said she admitted students into physical therapy school based on their life experiences. And I didn't know Lynda Woodruff's life experience until I went to her funeral and learned that she integrated a white high school and was one of 2 students, and that she had Martin Luther King in her living room talking to her and her parents about the courage that it would take to do that. And then it all came full circle. I was like, oh, that's the life experience that Geneva Johnson was talking about. That's what brought Lynda Woodruff into our profession. And then she took that and paid it forward in her admissions processes and brought so many incredible leaders into our profession. Then through the House telling APTA board to reaffirm our commitment, our strategic planning was based on data. And one of the 4 themes in our strategic plan is stewardship. It's about the future of the profession. And with stewardship comes strategic investments in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I hear you, Sonora. What does diversity mean? But I can assure you that the data is there and that the sustainability of the efforts are there. We're creating a new standing committee that will help us in these efforts, that will have 14 members. So this is not a task force. It's not something that'll be one and done and make recommendations and they go away. It's a standing committee, just like the Finance and Audit Committee is, that we use to set our budget every year, just like the Ethics and Judicial Committee are. So we only have a few of these standing committees. So we don't expect this to be a one and done because we know we got a lot of work to do. So the work is sustainable, and whomever comes after me as president will have an APTA staff and CEO who has been behind these efforts from the beginning of his tenure at APTA, and the staff is fully vetted and behind this.
May I jump in just a minute, please?
Sure.
One of the areas that I didn't hear, and where, in my experience, where we really have a problem is one is in admissions in the various schools, but more importantly is how Black students, or now I'll even say any minority students, are treated in clinical sites and how they are assessed. So for instance, I have repeated the study that was done by Wilda many years ago, which looked at the difference in how Black PT students are assessed in the clinic. And it did not change over the past. I did it for 10 years and then I did it in another 10 years and nothing has happened. What it is that we found that reading the same script, dressed just alike, that African-American students would be rated much lower than white students. And so we need to look at you need to work with your clinical coordinators and the people who take, and also this whole business of, I don't accept certain students. And there are many schools that will just say, I don't accept certain students. And a number of them might be minority. So we need to do almost a root cause analysis in order to see exactly where we need to start. But starting at the top isn't going to do it. We've got to get them in the school first and make sure that they have a chance at being admitted. And then we have to make sure that I don't know what we're going to do now that we're all online, but in the clinic that they are treated with dignity and respect, and that you don't have students that said, oh yeah, I went to that clinic, but I can tell you I'll never work there and I don't want to be bothered with them anymore. So Robert is one that I love when he said it pissed him off, because that's what a lot of the students, the Black students, or even minority students will say. So they absent themselves and they segregate themselves on purpose because they don't want to be bothered and they are too tired to be tired again about working with white people to try to teach them to treat them with dignity. So after a while you get tired. And so what do? You just go by yourself and you say, I don't have to be bothered.
So that's a great, go ahead, Rob, yeah.
I want to make sure I didn't use that term exactly. If I did, I apologize.
What dear?
The term pissed off.
No, you didn't, but it said the same thing. Now, so I understand that wasn't and just forgive old people for using terms that you would never, ever use. You would never, ever use pissed off, I'm sure.
Lisa told us we had to say the words, so Sonora's saying the words.
There you go.
Okay, so I want to
interject something real quick, Jason.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that you'd be proud of the construction of my company, and that we do have white folks and Black folks working together. I've trained in residency to a high level of competency, fellowship level orthopedic manual therapists that are Black and white. And so I know that this may not be the rule, but I set out to build a company that was diverse, and we've gotten that done, and we're continuing to work on things. And we're having sisterships with other corporations like Philip Smith's group in Kansas City. And also Joseph Bartucci reached out to me this week. He's in Philadelphia, asking what he can do to help create a more diverse staff. So the dialogue is happening. It may not be happening quickly. It may be late, but it's not over. And I'm seeing some promise in what's happening with people reaching out to me and trying to create more diverse workforces, because you know, the more diverse the workforce, the better marketplace you're going to be able to penetrate. If we're just looking at clinical practice and access to care and who you're dealing with and making sure your clinic stays afloat.
I don't want you to be the onlyest one. You know, we've lived through this whole business of I'm the onlyest one, the onlyest Black, the onlyest one in the class. I don't want the onlyest one. I want that to be the way that we do, not that you are, someone would have to reach out to you to ask about it. They should know it. It should be a part of the DNA of the schools. And so, and of the practice. So it shouldn't be that you need to, we shouldn't be about teaching people to do this. People know what it is that they're supposed to do.
So Greg, I want to go to, you know, one of the beautiful things about your lecture is all the data you put behind it, right? And all the data that shows that with diversity, things are better, not just for some aesthetic reason or something like that, that literally the performance improves. So it's not just about humanity improving, it's about actually the results improving. And so I don't want to recap the entire lecture because people can go watch that, and that's for there, and this is for here. But I mean, as you're thinking about those how we take that next step in terms of, you know, I don't even want to talk, if you want to talk about adapt, but describe sort of how you get off the ground toward what Rob's talking about to get that next step of diversity, or if you want to talk about the recommendations to go into CAPTI, but there are things that we can do to start slowly but surely making actual real change in this matter to get actual evidence-based better results from having a diverse set of minds, experiences, skin colors, all of that.
Right. So, you know, for me, I've had similar experiences as what everyone's talking about. You know, going back 15 years ago, probably, I've had conversations with folks at APTA about really trying to move the needle here. I wasn't satisfied with where things went. I think the last major interaction I had was maybe a decade ago, and I sort of, I mean, I've been involved with APTA the entire time, but I made a decision that I was going to go away. I was going to do what I could do to influence things in my own world. And when I became more successful and I had a space where I had a voice that people wouldn't be able to ignore at that point, then I was going to talk as loudly as I could. And one of the things that I went back and did was, in our university, we had a President's Diversity Initiative, and you could get funding to start a program. And we started the ADAPT program. My partner in crime is Jeannie Warrington, who is a white woman who is very passionate about seeing kids of color come into physical therapy. And she and I work together. Most of it is really based around mentoring these young students. You know, we talk about pipeline programs. I'm impatient. The idea of doing a pipeline program where I would start in middle school, I just wanted to see results quicker. And we started talking to folks at our university, realized that 20% of the main feeder undergraduate program for PT school were people who were Latino, African American. So we decided, let's work here. And that's where a conversation started. And over time, it's just changed and morphed to the point now where we have kids contacting us from other universities and saying, look, I know that I don't go to UD, but is it possible that I could participate in your program in some way? We've had kids come and do research experiences with, you know, therapists in our department who do research. So we are just trying to engage with folks in a different way and really build a relationship. I think everything is about relationships. That's how life works. So I want to develop a relationship with them so that they are prepared to be successful. I don't want anyone to feel like they've got to go out of their way to reach down to take any of these students into their PT programs. I want them to be at the top of their list. And there's no reason that that can't be the case. And we've seen a lot of nice success over the years. But you know, this idea that I talked about in the lecture of diversity being really important to enhance performance in an environment where there's innovation. We at the University of Delaware, we think that we're innovative and we're constantly pushing. I think it works, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been friction along the way. But I think that has to be anticipated, that there's going to be that, because the more people you have that are different, there's going to be that friction, but that's where the good stuff actually happens and you're allowed to grow and become better. If you just keep everything stable, you're not going to go anywhere. And so I think that's the really important part of it, is realizing that none of this is going to be easy, but if you don't start, it's never going to happen. And I think that's all I have to say on that. I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. You had a whole lecture.
Right.
You can.
Right.
I'm gonna take a question here from the Q&A that I think is good. It's somebody who said they've experienced clinical PT staff discourage promising minority applicants to pursue other professions instead of physical therapy, or encourage them to pursue other professions instead of physical therapy due to costs, earning power, mobility. How do we advocate for our own profession at this point in time? So do folks have ideas for whether for clinics or clinicians, for educators, for future students? How do we advocate for our profession? We can talk about, specifically for to increase Black participation in and inclusion in our profession. Let's start with that group and talk about how we would do that. Lisa?
So I did read that question, and truthfully, the first thing that jumped out to me was that is probably a person that there was not a similarity in communities in that conversation. Because what you often find is that Black and brown students, clinicians, there is a different feeling for why we are in the profession sometimes, right? There is more of a communal sense, and I'm saying that in very stereotypical terms, but there are cultural differences sometimes that have to be acknowledged. And so I feel like there might have been some discordance in that conversation in regards to cultures. But I think ultimately, when you're talking about the physical therapy profession, you've got to talk about the ability to impact the disability burden within those communities, right? So you've got to know about those communities. And I think that's where we're often at a disadvantage, where we're not prepared to have conversations about how 1 in 4 African American has a disability, or about the high prevalence of chronic disease management, or about the lack of access of physical therapy clinics in Black and brown communities. So you've got to be able to have that conversation, which almost becomes a call to action for that student. The conversation about earning potential and money, yes, financial toxicity affects us all, but I often find that the drivers are very different across those different communities. That's my opinion.
As we talk about this, I'm kind of going off of Greg's point on that too, of the, we're going to have to go through friction to make positive change, right? The lack of friction has got us where we are. I don't imply that there's never been friction, right? But there hasn't been enough friction to make change rapidly enough. How do we navigate that friction in terms of knowing, and Rob, I'm going to throw this question to you. When you talk about building a business that you're proud of the diversity that's ended up, what was the friction that you experienced along the way, to the degree that there was friction, and how did you manage that so that it was a positive friction and not a negative?
No doubt that any physical therapist on this panel or in America that's Black, 30 years ago when I first came to Little Rock, I had several patients not let me treat them because I was Black. Now, this is after I'd finished my residency in orthopedic manual therapy, and I was brought in to be the spine guy. That's friction. And one thing that we have to point out is when you're Black, you're dealing with a decreased margin for error. So you get up every morning, know that you almost have to be perfect to make any type of gains. Just like Sonora was talking about, being graded more harshly than someone else would. I remember being in physical therapy school, and when I transferred into Missouri, they had a bunch of bones on the table, and I put the acromion process of the scapula, dry bone there. And it was marked wrong because I didn't say the scapula bone. And so, Greg, in your lecture, you also talked about retention. And I got a D on that first test because of that. And I had to ace everything else after that in the first course to even stay in PT school and get a B out of the class. So the friction, not just with starting a practice, but engaging all the way through, develops a building level of frustration all the way through. And so it's hard to stay positive. I'm glad that we have groups like the Black Physical Therapy Association and the AAPT, so that we have groups that you're going to have somewhere to turn to get some love.
Mhm.
Okay, you got to have some type of fuel to be able to engage in it with a positive attitude. You have to.
Yeah, Remy, do you want to talk about, for people who may not know about your organization, you know, what role you feel you play in offering that support that Rob's talking about?
Sure. So as far as like NABPT, we're here to, yes, definitely help in improving the Black participation within our field, and honestly from the community as well. If we all, yes, sometimes we do want to have that mix of a clinic, but sometimes you don't, because that's not how the community looks. And I know for myself, going to Spelman, I still saw the diversity. You know, that there, and if you don't know Spelman, it's an all women's Black college. And from there, I got my self-confidence, I got my voice to then integrate into what the society looks like. So sometimes you do need that, and that's somewhat of what NABPT is about: understanding the financial literacy of, you know, navigating student loans, navigating finances and all. Like, we don't have generational wealth. That's not what we're known for, because of everything that we have to go through to get where we are. So navigating that, because sometimes these people are first generation to even graduate school. So we have on one side a lot of catching up to do to interact with our counterparts. So sometimes we need that similarity of just skin color, because we tend to be killed just because our skin color. So there's a lot of, as far as like navigating through social injustices within your clinic, having that mentorship, having that, you know, brother sister love, or non-binary love, and working through all those deficits that we have to overcome, and then also having that marginalized room for error. There's no room for error, really.
Greg, when you think, I'm pulling from a question here, but I think it kind of relates to this, as we're talking about, I mean, Sonora referenced obviously the long history of stops and starts, and we're committed, you know, and then things fizzle out and all of those things. And again, just to be very clear, while APTA can look at people like Jeanette Meadows, who are instrumental in pushing APTA to whatever progress it got to, you know, if APTA thought we had this figured out, we wouldn't have the need for this call today, right? So there's the definite need for progress. How do we define success on this issue? Because it is, and especially into Sonora's point, when we look at Black participation in physical therapy, the numbers are at a red alert. They're bad. They don't align with what we're seeing across other healthcare fields. So there's something to look at there. But how do we recognize what success is as we're starting to move forward? And I'm not saying like success is in we're done, we walk off the playing field, the game's over, it's won. I just mean, how do we chart incremental progress and know what success even looks like in this issue that goes beyond our association, goes beyond our profession, and is an American problem?
Ooh, light question, huh?
Yeah.
You know, I think for me, the biggest thing right now is to truly diversify the field. Education programs have to change. There has to be a different way of admitting students. There has to be a push. There has to be accountability to pursue students of color, in particular Black students. So I think we can't even talk about success until we start to see some numbers change there on that front. The numbers are on the decline. It's not even just that they're staying stable at a low level. They're at a low level and declining to a lower level. Exactly. That's a big problem. So I think that for me is one of those measures that, you know, if I could put a number to something, that would be something that I would look at.
Lisa, yeah.
So I do agree that the numbers are needed. That is one of our opportunities. I also, though, feel really strongly about the fact of that someone in the questions had asked about a book, a resource that we would recommend. And so
hold that thought though, because I do want, that's gonna be our final question. So don't go too deep, but go. Okay.
But I won't give the name of my book, but I will tell you that policies matter. And so even if we change the leadership, even if we start making efforts to diversify, until the local policies within every PT program changes, there will not be meaningful, impactful, sustainable change, because that is where the micro and macro aggressions are occurring. Yes, we've got issues on the national level, but it is those local, those DPT and PTA programs where you're having biases and admission practices. People are scared to make a change because they're scared of CAPTE. People are scared to push back on racist things that they hear within the program. That is where the change has to be made. And that's going to require leaders that are going to be willing to call out faculty members and students that are misbehaving. It's going to require us to be courageous in who we admit, and not keep carrying on this myth about if we admit more Black students, we're going to drop in our metrics, because that study's already been done by 6 other healthcare disciplines and it wasn't true. So can we just stop telling that lie? And then someone was asking about, well, how do we get this out to other people? How do we stop talking to the choir?
That's where I was going next. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go.
And we need a campaign. Just like we had a campaign for membership, most of us know who's misbehaving. Most of us know who just isn't at the growth edge. So if each one of us could reach out to 1 or 2 of those people, that would be great. And that is, to me, where white people get to do the work, right? So the question always comes up, what is it that we can do? You need to go talk to another white person. You know who needs to put in a little more self-work or who needs a conversation.
That's a great point. I want other people to have, that was the next question I was going to ask, is how we keep the, whether somebody's watching live tonight or makes time for this tomorrow or whenever, they're already showing an interest, right? And I don't want to say that means they're perfect, right? We can all grow, but they're showing an interest, and it's crucial to reach people who, for whatever reason, are tuning this issue out. And I'm speaking broadly when I say this issue. Other thoughts on how we get to those people who are not paying attention for whatever reason?
We need to get to the communities in which they live, and we need to really engage in the policy makers of different communities and get a champion for our cause. Because a lot of course, in many states, in many communities, the people who are in leadership roles are white. And often, for instance, with me, it was a matter of finding the person who was in charge of the big hospital and actually hounding him until he hired Black PTs. So we have to become very aggressive, and you don't have to be loud to do it. You don't have to, but the other thing is we don't need to get credit for everything that we do. You use all of the resources that you have, and a lot of them will come not from the PT world, but either from the health world altogether, or even just a politician who is interested in improving the plight of their constituents. So we need to find different ways to reach out and use people who are in authority, because to keep talking to poor people who have no authority to move anything, you're wasting your time. So we need to make sure that we get people on boards and in leadership roles in the community, and then you can push your whatever it is you want to do. So make sure that that's what you're doing. We often, and for many of, we'll close it, all of you know that I cured polio in Brownsville, Texas, right?
Tell that story, Sonora.
All right, well, the example of someone not accepting you, so that when I came out of school, I was very close to the person that was in charge of the American Red Cross. and the Polio Foundation, and they wanted a PT to go to Texas who was really good with muscle testing and getting the people in coming off the ships in Brownsville. And so they selected, I had just graduated and I was to go to Brownsville, Texas. And when I called, when my mother, who insisted that she had to know where I was going to stay in Texas, and when I called and I said, you know, I guess I'm going to stay at the nurse's station because, you know, well, all of you know that I've been colored, Black, Negro, you know, I've been through the whole business. And so I said, you know, I'm colored. And there was a silence on the phone, and we'll have to get back to you. And then when they did call me back, they said they didn't need a PT. Well, my champion, who was a PT, who was one time the president of the APTA, she said, you take her or nobody. So obviously I had cured polio. They didn't need anybody, don't you think? So I have lived with this all of my life, and that's my story, and I'm sticking by it.
I'm not going to argue with you. We've been doing this, believe it or not, for almost a full hour, and there are tons of questions I didn't get to, tons of questions have been submitted. I'm sorry I didn't get to. We could easily do this for longer, but in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap us up. But I do want to go round robin one more time. And Lisa started to tease this question. You know, Greg, I'm going to push back on one thing. One of your pieces of advice, which seems simple on the surface, is to self-educate. The challenge is a lot of people think they're self-educating, but they're self-educating off of things that are just, you know, reinforcing their current belief, right? And so if everybody can just go around and I don't want to get into what to stay away from, but something Sonora already mentioned, the Harvard study was a great thing to check, to assess your own biases and be real, but recommendations, whether it's a book, a person, a thing, where people can advance in their self-education. I just love to get a round robin recommendation from everybody to wrap up tonight. Greg, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would actually recommend Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois. You know, it was written in the early 1900s, and it talks about the freedom struggle for Black Americans in the early 20th century. And unfortunately, I relate way too much to the things that Du Bois was talking about in the early 1900s. You know, he talks about this idea of a dual consciousness that Black Americans have to have. One consciousness is about how they view themselves, and the other is about how the majority world around them views them. And sadly, that is something that people of color here every day live with. And so I think that book this collection of essays can really help people to understand that in a clear way. The other thing I would quickly say is Emmanuel Acho has these video series, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. It's worth looking at, something a little bit more current.
Okay, Remy?
Right. I would say one podcast, The Diversity Gap. And then as far as a book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria Together by Beverly Daniel Tatum.
Okay. Rob?
The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson spoke of the need to make sure that we're being functionally educated and gaining skills that are applicable in a society where you have a skill set once you get finished with your education that you can actually be remunerated for and gain some prosperity. I think that book still is relevant today.
Sharon?
So I'm writing down all these titles because I'm hungry for more reading material. But a couple of things. One was recommended to me a couple of years ago by my nephew that made a difference, and it was Martin Luther King's writing from the Birmingham jail. And it was such a powerful and soul-moving piece about his situation at the time of right in the middle of the civil rights movement that he was leading. And if you're a white person, to read that and see yourself and who he thought were his friends who weren't stepping up and doing what he thought would be very helpful to him at that time. And the other book that I've read is The History of Lincoln, and through the Emancipation Proclamation and how he developed his cabinet is called The Team of Rivals, written by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And he chose people that he knew would be against it to include on his cabinet because he knew that he could make his argument better by surrounding himself with people who thought differently than him. And I think that's a lesson for all of us as we try to do what Rob has done in his practice. It's creating diversity, surround ourselves with people different than us, and it really makes a team fly when your gaps are covered. So those are the two that I have, but I'm busy writing down the recommendations from my co-panelists.
Sonora, you already threw one out, but I can give you a chance in another one.
Oh, I don't think we need to read a thing. What we need to do is do. So, yeah, I'm not your Negro is what, anything that Baldwin's has written, but also look at Dean Howard Thurman, who is actually the person that mentored and tutored Martin Luther King, who was at BU when I was there. We've had a lot of literature and you'll read a lot of things, but the time for reading is over. So quit reading and get busy doing.
Lisa?
So in that same vein, I'm going to give 3 books that are action oriented. So for self-work, I highly recommend 28 Days, Me and White Supremacy. It's a daily journal that kind of gives you the lexicon, and it has these beautiful reflective questions in it. And we actually have a book club right now that's meeting on Wednesdays. So if anybody wants to join, you can join us in that journey. So that's kind of personal work. In regards to interpersonal, community, organization, there is another journal club that is reading Upstream, and that is by Heath. And that book changed my life, y'all. I just read it this month, and it really challenges you to think about what is going on above this issue so that you're not responding, but you can actually get in a prevention mode. And so I really think for us as an organization, as programs, we've got to do the work of start thinking about what are we doing that's causing this problem? Because he has this quote that talks about you get the outcome based on what you created. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we're having the same conversation for 30, 40 years is because we have created this.
60 years, not 40, 50, 60 years.
60 years, Dr. Simpson.
60 years.
I made it relative to my age. I stand corrected.
Can you just believe it? 60 years. We've been talking
Probably
about
would be 100 years if they had let us in earlier. The third book is The Color of Law by Rothstein. And that is a system societal level book that allows you to look at how we manipulate policies to marginalize certain people. And so it talks about redlining and housing and educational segregation. And so it's just a good objective history of this is what we did as Americans. And so it is a great Sankofa moment for you to look back at the past and learn from it so that we only make mistakes and not failures, y'all. Those are 2 very different things.
Okay, so if you're watching this tonight, don't say you didn't come away with something. We had a lot of recommendations. I would say on top of that, my recommendation would be if you somehow have not yet watched Greg's lecture, please watch Greg's lecture. Please watch it with someone. Please have a conversation with someone about it, especially if you are white. Please find someone who you can have a dialogue with about this and advance forward and see what you can do. We're not going to solve this tonight. We're not going to solve this tomorrow. Again, I'm grateful, and APTA is grateful, and all the people who collaborated, all the groups who collaborated to make this possible are grateful for the participation of people here, for everyone who's watching live or will watch later. It has to be more than conversation, but it's got to be at least conversation as we're working toward that action. Again, the groups collaborating on this are working on a resource where hopefully we will be collecting examples of people taking action. So people coming forward, clinics coming forward, programs coming forward saying, this is what I'm doing. to address this problem. And hopefully from that, we learn from each other. We can watch and see where success is happening, maybe faster than other places, and address those issues. So we're again, to Sonora's point, we are decades, too many decades into this. We also hope that we're at the start of something collaborative and beautiful and good, and we need that right now. So for everyone, thank you for tonight. Thank you for all of our panelists. The recording of this will be available tomorrow. If you know anybody who's asking who couldn't watch live, apj.org/Woodruff. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.